In the heart of a forgotten land, swallowed by ivy and the mists of time, stands the skeleton of a palace. Its marble bones bleach under a merciless sun, its halls echoing with a silence that screams of a story too terrible to be remembered, yet too potent to be completely erased. This was the seat of a short-lived dynasty, a kingdom born from ambition and buried by betrayal. They speak of a king whose crown was forged in fire, a queen whose beauty was a gilded cage, and a princess whose innocence was the final sacrifice upon the altar of power. The chronicle of their reign is not written in grand histories or royal decrees. It is etched in the bloodstains that refuse to fade from the floor of the great hall, the site of an infamous feast that served only death. This is the tale of that palace, of its doomed family, and of the night the wine flowed as freely as blood, a night known only in hushed whispers as the bloody banquet. A night where a kingdom, a king, a queen, and a princess were all consumed by the shadows they had invited into their home, leaving behind nothing but a monument to sorrow. The king, once a mere lord of the barren northern marches, was a man carved from granite and storm clouds. He did not inherit his throne, he took it. With a will of iron and an army bound to him by fear and gold, he swept across the fractured country, uniting it under a single blood-soaked banner. His name was whispered with a mixture of terror and awe. He was a conqueror, a brilliant strategist who saw the world as a board and its people as pieces to be moved or swept aside. In the early days, his rule brought a brutal kind of order. Roads were cleared of bandits and borders were secured. But the foundation of his kingdom was brittle, cemented with the bones of his rivals and the resentment of old houses. He craved legitimacy more than land, a dynasty to wash away the stain of his violent ascent. He sat upon his new throne, a master of war but a novice in peace, his eyes forever scanning the horizon for new conquests and the shadows in his court for new threats. The king needed a queen not for love but for legacy. He needed an heir, a son, to secure what he had stolen. From across the sea she came, a jewel offered in a political pact to quell the anxieties of neighboring empires. The queen was a vision of grace and nobility, her lineage ancient and pure, a stark contrast to the king's brutal origins. The people saw in her a promise of softness, a civilizing touch for their harsh ruler. Her arrival was met with pageantry and feigned celebration, but within the cold stone of the palace, she was an exotic bird in an iron cage. The king treated her as a prize, a beautiful vessel meant to carry his dynasty forward. The court, filled with the king's loyal but crude bannermen, viewed her with suspicion. Her customs were strange, her language melodic but foreign. The queen walked through the gilded corridors, her silk gowns whispering against the stone, her heart a lonely drum in the suffocating silence. She was surrounded by opulence but starved of warmth, a queen in name but a prisoner in reality. She smiled for the court, but in the solitude of her chambers she saw the truth of her marriage. She was merely the womb of the kingdom. The kingdom held its breath, praying for a son to solidify the king's precarious reign. When the queen's time came, the bells of the capital were ready to ring in triumph, but they rang with a muted, almost apologetic chime. A princess was born, a beautiful, fragile girl with her mother's eyes and a spirit that seemed too pure for the world she had entered. The king looked upon his daughter, the Princess Lyra, and his face was a mask of strained pride, hiding a chasm of disappointment. A girl could not lead armies, could not inherit his iron will. She was another piece to be bartered, another marriage alliance in the making. For the queen, however, the princess was everything. She was a reason to endure the cold marriage, the suspicious court, the king's consuming ambition. In her daughter's laughter, the queen found the only genuine warmth in the entire cavernous palace. She would shield the princess from the coming darkness, a promise she made to the heavens, unaware that the darkness was already seeping through the cracks in the throne itself. The palace, for all its grandeur, was a place of secrets. Whispers slithered through the halls like unseen serpents, breeding in the shadows of tapestries and behind closed doors. The king's paranoia, a seed planted during his bloody rise to power, was now a thorny vine strangling his court. He trusted no one, not his advisors, not his guards, and least of all, his foreign queen. Ambitious lords, resentful of the queen's influence and eager to gain the king's favor, fed him a steady diet of rumor and insinuation. They spoke of her strange loyalties, of letters sent to her homeland, of her quiet melancholy being a mask for dissent. The queen felt the unseen eyes on her, the sudden silences when she entered a room. The princess grew up in this poisoned atmosphere, learning to tread lightly, to speak softly. She could feel the chill that passed between her father and mother, a silent, undeclared war fought in glances and gestures. The king, queen, and princess lived under one roof, a family in name only, each trapped in a private prison of fear and suspicion as the shadows grew longer and bolder. The king's disappointment in having a daughter only fueled the raging fire of his ambition. If he could not secure his legacy through a male heir, he would carve it into the world with his sword. He launched a series of reckless wars, aiming to expand his borders and fill his coffers with the plunder of fallen cities. Victory made him a legend, but the cost was immense. The kingdom bled gold and men, and a quiet famine began to stalk the countryside. His triumphs in battle made him more arrogant, more deaf to the counsel of wiser men. He saw his daughter, the young princess, not as a child to be cherished, but as his most valuable diplomatic tool. He began entertaining suitors for her, grizzled warlords and decrepit foreign kings, weighing their offers of armies and alliances. The princess was a commodity, her future a bargaining chip in her father's relentless game of power. The king, who had once fought to build a kingdom, was now willing to sacrifice his own family to feed his insatiable hunger for more. The queen watched her husband's descent into tyranny with a heart that had long since turned to ice. She saw the fear in the eyes of her subjects and the growing hollowness in her daughter's smile. Her attempts to reason with the king were met with scornful dismissal or cold, menacing silence. He saw her pleas for peace as weakness, her concerns for their daughter as sentimental foolishness. Isolated and powerless, the queen's desperation began to fester. She had been brought to this kingdom to be a passive symbol, but she refused to let her daughter become a lamb for the slaughter. She began to forge her own alliances, secret meetings in moonlit gardens with courtiers who also feared the king's madness. It was a perilous game. Every loyal smile could be a mask, every whispered promise a trap. She knew that discovery meant death, but the thought of the princess being married off to a brutal stranger was a fate she considered far worse. The queen, who had arrived as a pawn, was now learning to play the game, unaware that the board was already set for her own destruction. Princess Lyra grew in the palace gardens, a wildflower thriving in a fissure of cold stone. Her world was one of stark contrasts, the vibrant beauty of the flowers she tended and the grim, muted tones of her father's court. She was her mother's light, a gentle soul in a house built on violence. She learned poetry and music, her heart drawn to stories of heroism and true love, tales that seemed like fantasies in her gilded cage. Her father, the king, was a distant, intimidating figure, a thundercloud on the edge of her world. She saw him mostly at state dinners, his eyes sweeping over her with a dispassionate, calculating gaze. She knew she was a disappointment, the daughter who should have been a son. Her only true solace was found in the quiet friendship of a young court musician whose melodies offered a fleeting escape. This innocent bond, however, was a danger she could not comprehend. In a court where every interaction was scrutinized, her simple happiness was seen as a potential weakness, another thread for the king's enemies and the king himself to pull. Her destiny was as fragile as a butterfly's wing, destined to be crushed by the iron fist of the throne. The queen, in her desperate search for a weapon against her husband, unearthed a secret buried deeper than any dungeon. It was a truth hidden in a scorched royal decree, a secret whispered by a dying priest who had served the previous dynasty. Her husband, the great king, was not just a conqueror, he was a regicide. He had not won the throne in a noble battle, but had seized it through a treacherous midnight massacre, murdering the old king, his wife, and their young children in their sleep. The story he had told the world, of a corrupt monarchy overthrown for the good of the people, was a masterfully crafted lie. The queen now held the key to his undoing, a truth so venomous it could dissolve his crown and turn his entire kingdom against him. She believed this secret was her salvation, the leverage she needed to protect the princess and force the king's hand. She planned to use it to expose him at the upcoming harvest banquet, an event attended by every powerful noble in the realm. She saw it as a checkmate, a final move to save her daughter. She never imagined she was only arming the man who would pull the trigger. The kingdom was a cauldron of dissent, ready to boil over. The king's endless wars had emptied the treasury and filled the cemeteries. The nobles, whose sons had died on foreign fields for the king's glory, plotted in the shadows. They learned of the queen's explosive secret not from her but from the spies they had placed within her own circle. They saw her not as an ally, but as a perfect catalyst for the chaos they desired. Her plan to expose the king at the banquet was their opportunity. They would let her light the fuse, and in the ensuing explosion they would seize power for themselves. The great hall was decorated for the feast, hung with tapestries depicting the king's victories, glorious lies woven in thread. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats and spiced wine, but thicker still with tension and betrayal. The king, the queen, and the princess took their places at the high table, a family of strangers about to perform the final act of their tragedy. The queen's hand trembled as she reached for her goblet, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. The throne was about to fall, but it would not fall the way she had planned. The banquet began, a symphony of false laughter and clattering silver. The queen waited for her moment, her gaze fixed on the king who reveled in the hollow praise of his lords. Just as she drew a breath to speak, to unleash the truth that would shatter his reign, one of the nobles she had confided in rose to his feet. But he did not look at the king, he looked at her. In a booming voice he accused her of high treason, of plotting with her foreign kinsmen to assassinate the king and place a puppet on the throne. He twisted her desperation into a narrative of betrayal, producing forged letters as proof. The king's face, a mask of shock for the court, hardened into cold, knowing fury. It was his move, his checkmate. He stood pointing a damning finger at his wife, his voice thundering through the now silent hall. "Let this be a lesson to all traitors," he roared. Before the queen could utter a single word of her truth, a royal guard, acting on a silent command, drew his sword. The blade flashed in the torchlight. The queen collapsed, a crimson flower blooming on her silken gown, her dying eyes finding her daughter, the princess, whose scream was swallowed by the sudden, deafening roar of chaos. The queen's murder was the spark that ignited the pyre. The carefully orchestrated betrayal spun out of control. The nobles, seeing the king's brutal preemptive strike, knew they were all implicated, all condemned. Their own plot exposed, their only option was to fight. Daggers were drawn, swords scraped free of scabbards, and the bloody banquet began in earnest. The grand hall became an abattoir. Loyalists and rebels clashed amidst overturned tables and shattered goblets of wine that mixed with the spreading pools of blood. The king, a warrior to his core, fought like a cornered wolf, his royal robes drenched in the gore of his own court. But he was outnumbered. His personal guard fell around him, and he was finally overwhelmed, not by a single valiant foe, but by a dozen grasping, stabbing hands. They did not grant him a swift death. They dragged him from the carnage, a broken, bleeding king, and chained him in his own dungeon. His downfall was not a quiet abdication, but a cacophony of violence and screams, a brutal end mirroring his own brutal beginning, forced to listen as his kingdom was torn apart above him. Princess Lyra watched the world end from the high table. She saw her mother fall, a vision of red on white that would be seared into her memory forever. She saw her father, the terrifying, invincible king, pulled down by a tide of his own vengeful subjects. She was frozen, a porcelain doll in a charnel house. As the fighting spread through the palace, she was grabbed not with care, but with the rough urgency of a liability. The victorious nobles, now squabbling over the spoils of their bloody coup, saw her not as an innocent child, but as the last remnant of a hated dynasty. She was the king's daughter, a symbol who could one day be used to rally loyalists and challenge their newfound power. They could not afford such a risk. Her fate was decided not in a court of law, but in a hurried, whispered conference in a blood-spattered antechamber. There was no exile, no quiet convent. They led the silent, trembling princess up the winding stairs of the highest tower. Under a cold, indifferent moon, they ensured that the king's bloodline and the final, innocent victim of his ambition would trouble them no more. Her story ended not with a crown, but with a choked whisper into the unforgiving night. In the aftermath, no peace followed. The coalition of ambitious lords who had orchestrated the king's downfall immediately turned on one another, their shared purpose dissolving as soon as the throne was empty. The kingdom fractured, plunging into a bitter and protracted civil war that bled it for a generation. The great palace was ransacked and abandoned, its treasures looted, its tapestries torn from the walls. It became a haunted, shunned place, a tomb for a royal family and the hopes of a nation. Rain washed the blood from the courtyard stones, but not from the memory of the land. The story of the bloody banquet became a cautionary tale whispered by peasants, a grim fable about how the greed of the great grinds the innocent to dust. The names of the warrior king, the tragic queen, and the lost princess were lost to official history, scrubbed away by the new rulers. But their ghosts remained, forever bound to the decaying halls, a testament to a dynasty that clawed its way into existence only to devour itself in a single night of unimaginable horror. Power is a hungry ghost, and a crown is but a gilded circle of sorrow. The palace stands as proof, a silent witness to the immutable truth that ambition, when untethered from mercy, builds only its own mausoleum. The wind that sighs through its broken arches carries the echoes of their final moments, the defiant roar of a falling king, the last desperate gasp of a betrayed queen, and the terrible silence that followed a young princess's final plea. Their pursuit of a legacy left nothing but rubble and a story stained with regret. The banquet is long over, the guests have long since departed to their graves, but the tragedy remains. It serves as a chilling reminder that thrones are often built upon foundations of bone, and the price of absolute power is and always will be absolute loss. Their tale is a dark mirror, reflecting the fragility of life and the relentless, cruel march of fate that waits for kings, queens, and princesses alike. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.